I know that a lot of you come for sort of this nuts and bolts component. And so before, I do have sort of a list of questions that I'm curious about. But before I launch into that, I wanted to check in and see if anybody in the audience had very targeted questions. Again, this is your fundamentals of DPC component. So if you have nuts and bolts questions, now is the time to ask them. Jamie.
Okay, this is for Imagine a little bit, but I know you said you had a 2-hour new patient visit, and I have a DPC myself. I just opened in March 2017, and I kind of find at the end of an hour I'm tired, and the patient is tired, and they actually didn't expect it to go so long. So it's no problem to just say, can you come back next week, and we'll do another hour, because I need more time with you. And second, it would seem hard to actually get other stuff done, because stuff that happens while you're kind of locked up with someone for 2 hours. So how do you make that work? Because I do need 2 hours with a lot of people, but I don't actually know how to make my workflow work with something like that.
Great question. I don't find myself tired at 2 hours. I actually find it goes really quickly. I'll tell you, the first thing I did to make that work for myself was sit down and had to reprogram in my brain how I wanted the visit to go, because over the years, when the time I got to spend with patients was slowly narrowed, and that line in the sand was slowly, almost unnoticeably moved, I unconsciously adjusted my style, and I had to consciously break those habits, because I was finding initially that I was finishing up quickly. And so I actually sat down and planned exactly how do I want the flow of that 2 hour to go. And so I have a very scripted way of doing it. I start by saying I'm going to do 3 things in these first visits. So I say the first thing is I want to make a list of everything you want to talk about today. And I want to start at a very high 10,000 foot level. Don't go into any detail. I just want to understand the universe of what's on your mind. And then I say, second thing is I'm going to go back and take your entire medical history. And then I'm going to come back and actually go through those issues you brought up one by one, going into detail. Then I'm going to do a head-to-toe physical exam. And then we're going to come and we're going to finish up and we're going to talk about each of those issues. And I find that by setting the expectation at the beginning for both the patient and myself, we pace ourselves. And so, for me, the greatest thing about 2 hours, I don't always use it, but the greatest thing about it is I'm no longer worried about getting to the next patient. The other thing is, the way I've set up my office to work is, there are 2 lines I have. I have a direct line and an emergency line, and during office hours, all the emergency codes go to my MA. And so the patients all know that if they call that emergency line and it's a true emergency, she will come and interrupt me, pull me out of the patient room to talk to that patient. Otherwise, all those messages go to my direct line. And I find just the way the day goes and, with the number of patients I have, I can catch up quite easily. So that's how I do it.
Just going to add something to that quickly. I also spend generally 2 hours for new patient visits or for physicals, but I break those up into 2 1-hour segments and sort of make the first segment about information gathering, and then the second session about going over the information and making the plan. That seems to be less overwhelming than 2 hours at once.
Excellent, thank you. Any other comments about workflow management? Great. Audience, any other questions that you're dying to ask? Right here.
I had a quick question on the front office skills and of your staff and everything. Are you finding that your front office and your best salespeople bringing it in, and this might be more of a question for Jason there, are they people who historically have been in healthcare before, or are you bringing them out from, say, a hospitality sector, just have a little bit more customer service than what we traditionally see in typical medical front office?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. The way that we've gone about hiring is mostly we've looked at culture because we feel like the overall experience we want to have all of our patients have a wonderful experience with us. So we've actually had to fire a couple of our front office staff because they just weren't warm, right? We really value warmth to patients. Not everybody likes coming to the doctor, so it should be a wonderful experience. So that's all we look for in interviews. I really don't care what their previous experiences or anything. I mostly care about how they're going to treat patients and their love for people. So that's how I've gone about it.
To add to that, we picked our front office person based on somebody who had come out of retail And so she's fantastic talking to people, making the connection. They'll love her. And she didn't have any medical experience before.
To jump on that, having done private practice management and front desk hiring for a number of years, I'm going to share with you one of my most closely held secrets. For 20 years, we have used the Enneagram method. So the Enneagram is a personality type based on 9 different personality types predicated on Jungian archetypes. And 2 is the helper. And we find that 2s, regardless of their background, regardless of their education, they're helpers, and that's exactly what they need. So they thrive on a desire to please, and that's what you need at your front desk. Back desk is a very different issue. Medical assistant is a very different issue, LPNs, and then of course mid-levels, NPs and PAs, and they actually have very different personality types. So if you're really needing staff, identify exactly what it is that you need, identify the personality type associated with that, and then similar to identifying the ideal patient, market directly to that person, both through personal pools of referral and global pools. We do not see a large return from Indeed, LinkedIn, any of those job sites. The way that they are geared, they're very expensive, and they don't tend to there's not a lot of ROI on that if you're looking for staff, and be very difficult to, or be very discerning about overlap. So if you really need a staff person, and you really need somebody who's excellent at phlebotomy, you need somebody who's excellent and meticulous at the front desk, that is a very difficult combination to find. And so what we actually specialize in is finding sort of job share arrangements. So we find 2 closely related practices, and we're able to build 1.0 FTE phlebotomy between 2 or 3 different practices. And again, this is part of the vertical enhancement, right, where the movement is going. But I strongly recommend going from a personality analysis rather than a background analysis. Oh. Allison?
How do you find yourself using...
Hang on just a second, Allison.
How do you guys find yourself using your staff differently in this different model, especially when the patient is expecting that direct line of communication with yourself?
Yeah, so my view is that in an ideal world, the person who is at the answering the phone when a patient calls to make an appointment is the physician, him or herself. So when patients call our office to say, I need an appointment with Dr. Lickerman, they're not talking to our front desk person, they're calling me directly. Because what I find is maybe 30 to 40% of the time, I can take care of that problem that the patient thought they needed to come in for on the phone and be very efficient. And I prefer to be the person triaging my patients' complaint. In fact, I think that's part of our value add, is that you get to, not just you get a hold of your doctor easily, but you get a hold of your doctor. So we use our frontline staff to check people in, to verify demographic stuff, to do vitals, room them, and then on the back end to set up appointments, tests, all those types of things. But in terms of making appointments, and my patients really struggle with this. They sometimes call and say, I didn't realize I was going to get you. I wanted to make an appointment. I say, well, why are you calling? What's going on? So I've had to retrain my patient population to get used to that, but I find, that's what I should be doing. It never made sense to me that a non-clinical person would be answering the phone and sort of taking patient appointments, because a lot of times when patients think they need appointments, they don't. So that's the main way I've taken that away from them.
I would agree with that. I do all my own triage as well, and using the Spruce platform is helpful for that, because when messages come in, then I can see what it is and I can delegate it to my front office staff if they need to work on those things, or if it's an actual patient medical issue, then I can triage that and make sure we get it handled quickly and appropriately. What I delegate to the front office staff for what they're primarily occupied with, as it's different from fee-for-service. I think in the fee-for-service setting, they're primarily doing intake and explaining benefits and insurance benefits and all these things that your front office staff really shouldn't have to do. So now what my front office staff does is they're really kind of a Sherpa for the patient, getting everything through the system. So when they call in for things like refills, or they need a test approved, or they need to get to a specialist or whatever, my front office person is glued to Spruce and to the phone, and will get their problem solved, get them through to the solution. And of course, if she runs into anything along the way, I can help her out. But that's really what I see, where I see her role, and the patients love her for it.
That is beautiful. I love everything about that. We do find that that is the best approach. I think cognitively, what you have to recognize is that this is a deviation away from highest and best use of licensure, right? The reason you're accustomed to offshoring those, what are perceived as menial tasks or intake tasks is because the industrial healthcare compass wants to preserve the highest and best use of your licensure. And they're absolutely right. So much utilization can be avoided by a phone call of, I would imagine, less than 2 minutes, yeah? Yeah. Other questions? In the back there?
So as practice grows, one of the challenges that we've had, that we're having, and I wanted to get some input on those practices that have been open, is tracking and following up on terminations. So patients that unenroll for various reasons, I kind of wanted to hear what strategies you've implemented to follow up on terminations.
First off, one of the things I'm proudest about of the practice is we've had a really low termination rate. I've heard that it's 10% attrition is kind of a standard number. Ours is like 4%, and you can track it easily through Hint, which is nice. And almost every single person who has left, it's because they've moved away or passed away, or some other situation where they're not in the area. I've had a number of patients actually who have moved out of state and continue to use me as their primary care physician. So we had someone who canceled about a month ago, and I remember telling my staff, and this is 3 years into it, I remember telling my staff, wow, this is our first real cancellation. And it was, we saw things differently about how something should have been handled, and so she chose to go somewhere else. So, I mean, one of the beautiful things about DPC is your patients love you, and they love what the service that they're getting, and so generally they don't leave unless they have to.
So I try to prepare for that by what I say when patients join. And what I say when they join is, we don't have a contract. We don't hold anyone to a contract. It's a month-by-month thing. And I emphasize that. And I say because, of course, people may want to leave this practice for a variety of reasons, financially, personally, whatever. You're always free to leave. We don't take offense to that. We understand. And the reason I do that is because I think when people do leave a practice, especially depending on the reason, they may be very embarrassed to tell you. So I also have had a very low rate of patients leaving, most of them because they move or some have died. The next most common reason is financial, and usually when people do leave, they say that. I can think of only 2 patients who've left that gave me no explanation whatsoever, both of whom swore they loved me and loved the practice, and then suddenly abruptly said, I'm leaving and don't ask why. And when people have said they are leaving and don't ask why, I just say, well, that's totally fine, but I am always looking to understand how we may have failed in serving your needs. Can you give me some insight into that? And I've gotten answers about half the time. And so the other half, people are idiosyncratic and will make those decisions. You just won't know.
So you mentioned, I find all those things to be true that you said. I think one of the challenges we're having is, you said, well, they may leave for financial reasons, but we're having gaps where people are leaving and we're not sure why. Maybe it is financial. I'm wondering, how do you get that information? Do you have a standardized process of following up on people that terminate to get feedback?
Yeah, so what we do is we have a service cancellation form that they have to fill out. So that's part of the experience. When they call up and tell our front office that, hey, we need to cancel service, we say, great, we'll cancel your membership effective today, if that's what you want, or we can wait till the next month. But you just need to fill out a service cancellation form. And there's just a little part that they can either check a box, like this is why I left, or fill out details on that. So that's part of our process.
I actually call everybody myself if they want to terminate and say, it's been my pleasure taking care of you, and wish you the best. And usually they'll tell me at that point what the reason is.
I love that. I love the good goodbye. But I would also encourage you to think about this from a legal perspective. So we integrate two prophylactics. The first is we often have practices that want to have sort of a malleable termination provision. If you don't want to be here, we don't want you to be here. But we do have to insulate against what I call utilization abuse, right? So this is actually the urgent care person who's not getting what they need, want to come in and pay a $75 a month fee and get showboat service and then leave. And so we can insulate against that with an enrollment fee. And truthfully, if that enrollment fee is a financial obstacle for your patient, they're probably going to terminate anyway. So then it's up to you as to whether or not you want to essentially take that urgent care visit. I'm not saying don't, but at least you're making educated decisions for yourself. The second thing that we do is we recommend a re-enrollment fee. So people want to use services seasonally, right? When cold and flu is up or when their kids need sports releases or whatever, then they want to come see you and then they don't want to pay the other 6 months. And so we do recommend a termination fee. So if you leave and you want to come back, that's perfectly fine. But whatever the balance would have been, we're going to ask you to pay that just so that we can offset our costs. And then just to sort of back up what the doctors have said, I think it's fantastic that you're reaching out to your patients directly to get some feedback. But if you're having difficulty getting feedback, it might be the person who's asking the question. So there's this, if you have a fantastic front desk who has good relationships with your patients, they can often elicit more information. They can do it in a T setting rather than at the front desk where people can hear. I think that for the most part, patients have a very deep love for their physicians. And if there's a reason that they are rejecting you by terminating their membership, it can be horribly embarrassing to say that to your face. And maybe it's something deeply personal, or it very rarely is it related to care, because patients love to complain about care, right? I mean, they'll get all over Yelp and Google and say how you messed up their lab or whatever. And so usually it's something else. And so I do think that tracking terminations is very important. So be creative in the ways that you do that. And then, of course, you can always hire a third party, an objective third party that follows up with them afterwards, that's unrelated. And then sometimes people will just download on that person, right? If they're just perceiving that it's a customer service representative or whatever. And of course, you can do it via email. If you can anonymize the response, that will often take the sting out of, they don't want to be penalized in any way. They don't want you to think that you're going to go back and tell the rest of the medical community that she was a pain in the neck, and then they're going to have difficulty getting care. So anonymous, a soft voice or soft ear to receive the information, those are two really good strategies. Other questions? Right in front here, yes.
I was interested that you guys said that you were on the web and wanted to, as part of your marketing recruiting strategy, using Yelp and that sort of thing. I have a practice that has a tiny DPC in it, and the rest is capitated as seniors. In the past, I've had other things, other services that I offered. When I did that, especially, it doesn't attract the right people most times, actually. A lot of them come in with attitude. How do you filter that out? Whereas the patients who get word of mouth, they're humble. I find them to be humble and they really want to be there. The second part, if I may add that too, is that I see a lot of people put pictures of their waiting rooms, and it's nice. But how does that work for the senior patient? I mean, I try to have a nice one, but elaborate ones seem to, did make him disinterested more. And I assume that our DPC patients will age eventually, like the rest of us. How are you going to accommodate them, and what's your model on that? Which basically all qualify for Medicare at some point.
So if I understand, your first question is, how do you make sure the marketing efforts to attract the right patient? Did I get that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
What do you guys do about that?
Right. So as physicians, obviously there are patients who we enjoy taking care of more than some others. But my feeling is that I'm a societal resource, and I don't think in terms of the right and wrong patient. So if the issue is how do I defend against patients coming in who are going to abuse the system, that hasn't really been much a problem. And I think part of it is because I definitely saw, at least initially, you get with individual patients signing up, you get adverse selection, right? Patients who've been very dissatisfied with their experience in the medical system, whether because they tend to be a little sicker, a little more challenging. Frankly, I just welcome those patients. I'm thinking I created this model so I can take care of patients who the medical system has trouble with. And I have a number of patients who have completely fallen between the cracks in the traditional fee-for-service medical world. And I feel a great sense of purpose and mission in being able to care for them in the way that they really need and sort of defend them against the system. So I haven't had, and my guess is most people who are doing this haven't had a lot of patients who abuse the system. When they do, invariably it's because, in my experience, they're anxious. And if I address their anxiety, I have one patient who's calling me all the time, connecting with me in ways that were inappropriate, and I just confronted it direct. I called out the elephant in the room and said, so, the emergency line on weekends really isn't for things like routine refills, and you seem to call a lot for these things. Let's talk about what's driving this, in a very non-confrontive sort of way. And we had a great conversation. I knew he was anxious, and just recognized his anxiety was not adequately addressed. And so in doing that solved the problem. Obviously, this is a system where people can easily abuse it. And I think the answer is you simply hit that head on and have an open discussion about it. And your second question, I think, was how do we accommodate seniors and sort of in terms of sort of the physical office space? Is that?
How do you accommodate that as far as DPC model and patients qualifying for Medicare at that point?
Yeah. I think an internal medicine practice, which, I'm an internist, is to some degree largely a geriatric practice. So from the very beginning from office design to workflows, we were thinking a lot about the elderly and a lot of the, I think the real answer to that is how do we partner with other support services to help elderly as they decline, either because of aging or because of disease. And so it really is more along the lines of thinking about having good community partners who can help us with that. So patients who are demented, how do we get them to support services, that type of thing. And in my mind, that's really no different from any other medical practice thinking about those issues.
I'm just going to add to that. It's also how we wrote the content on our website. So if you go through and look at our website and you spend a lot of time there, we agonized over the story that we told. And so the story will appeal to a certain type of patient. And then the visuals that are on there, that really, it's attraction, right? It'll attract that sort of patient.
From a legal perspective, if you don't mind, Medicare is obviously very heavily regulated, and there's an interesting intersection of DPC. Now, there's a natural translation, and there are a number of initiatives trying to create synergy between the Medicare population and the DPC environment. It's a very natural relationship that has some pretty significant regulatory roadblocks. So if that's your particular patient population, definitely connect with the various coalitions that are doing legislative work both at the state and federal level. But just to give you an overview of what the legal rules are, we start with your Plan B. So if your failure plan is to go get a job somewhere else, then opting out of Medicare is probably not an option for you because it's a 2-year rolling. So it's not going to be possible for you to get a job while you are disenrolled from Medicare or opted out from Medicare. And there is a very thin urgent care exception to that, but I wouldn't want you to base your livelihood or the financial stability of your family on that very thin carve-out. If you do choose to opt out of Medicare, then you can privately contract with Medicare beneficiaries. And so it just depends. You can build a model that is maybe you have some fee-for-service and you have DPC, and then if you have a robust enough model, you may be able to have a different Plan B other than getting a different job, and that would allow you to address that population. There are some practices that want to basically have a Medicare concierge. So they want to bill Medicare like they always have, and then they're going to charge a fee on top of that for the additional time that they spend with patients. That is possible, but it's very important, again, that you bifurcate your designated health services away from your non-covered services. And if most of what you're doing is additional time with patients, then that may not be possible. So make sure that you get some legal and consulting support around that. I think we have time for about one more question, and I see a new hand in the back.
Regarding the concierge or hybrid or FDB practices, how do you find backup? What do you promise the patients as far as your availability for after hours or the weekends or if you're traveling or if you're sick, especially if you're a solo practitioner?
I'm on call 24/7 for my patients. The way that I think about it is there's about 20 minutes a day that I spend after hours working on patient things 7 days a week. And I think that's a marvelous trade-off compared to what my life was like before when I was in fee-for-service. So I'm delighted to spend those 20 minutes each day dealing with those calls and things. The only time I have another concierge doctor in my area who covers for me when I'm out, and I about 2 weeks a year I take advantage, and I also trade off with him and cover for him when he's gone. But the other 50 weeks out of the year, I'm on call 24/7.
Right now, we're bringing on our second physician in September, and so I have, like Brett, I'm on call 24/7, and I have taken some mini little vacations since we started, but really have not had any period of time where I've not been covering the patients. But I find, I imagine, like Brett, that because I'm so available during the day, and patients, when they discover how easily accessible I am, after-hours calls are rarely longer than 5 or 10 minutes, and in 2.5 years, I've had maybe 4 calls in the middle of the night. It's in true emergencies. But my plan has always been to scale, and so we bring on the other doctor. I want to create a system in which every doctor has a well-rounded life, and so we will obviously take each other's patients' calls when we're on vacation.
My legal practice is actually predicated on the DPC model. And I find something very similar. I find that because people are not having to constantly test the line to see if I'm available, they know that I'm there for them, and if I will pick up when I can, and if I can't, I will get back to you just as soon as possible. I don't have a lot of after hours or weekends calls, and if I do, they're done very respectfully. So that has not been a problem, and that's actually related to consumer buying profile and pattern of consumer utilization that's actually unrelated to the practice of medicine. It's just sort of how people act in the world. So if it's okay with you, I would like to just steer the conversation this way for just a minute. For people who are in Lorianne's position, and not her specific massive practice position, but for people who are really there, they're at the precipice, they're ready to go, I would love to hear from the physicians what, if you had one practical wish that could be granted, what would that wish be? And so one practical problem that you're experiencing, now that you've been doing this for a while, that hasn't been able to be resolved, that if I could grant you a wish, you would just make it go away.
Want to take that one first, Alex?
I'm thinking.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think as I mentioned in my presentation, the biggest challenge for me was the dealing with the overhead structure that I had to wind down, and so anything that you could do to plan for that. If you're starting from scratch, I agree exactly with what you said of try to minimize your build out and any of those expenses that you possibly can up front. And if you're planning ahead to make the transition, anything that you can plan ahead to wind down as far as your overhead as well.
So that gave me a chance to think of my answer, thanks. I actually designed the practice in such a way that it functions unbelievably well. I am completely happy and satisfied. So if there's any one thing that I could change, it would be the ease of getting new patients. We are at a place, I mean, I've been watching this very carefully, the general awareness of the DPC movement. It is starting to accelerate. So I'll give you an example. Yesterday, as we were flying in on the plane, we got an email from a reporter from the Chicago Tribune who's writing an article on DPC and wants to talk to us. A year ago, that would never have happened. We were reaching out to reporters, we were trying to connect with them, and they were like, yeah, we know DPC, we're looking for a new angle. It's starting to become more mainstream, and so, a rising tide lifts all boats, and so I think, the amount of work, what I find challenging is having to sell this, right? I mean, I think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I think this is the thing that's going to help save medicine. And if I would snap my fingers and magically make it happen, that it would be spread enough already that people are clamoring to get in because they recognize how wonderful this is. That would really save me a lot of work.
Zach, that's your homework.
Excellent. So, please, a round of applause for all the awesome panelists.